Buried, disinterred, abused, and used as a dark tourism attraction for nearly 300 years, this is the disturbing story of the appalling treatment, mutilation, and partial theft of the body of Katherine of Valois, a one-time Queen of England and the wife of Henry V. In this royal history documentary from History Calling, I'll delve into the original sources to show and explain how she ended up lying in an open coffin on the floor of Westminster Abbey, the disgraceful way in which she was used as a money-making scheme for centuries by those in charge of the building, why she was interred 3 times in 3 different centuries, and how onlookers describe the increasingly poor condition of her remains at various points in time, including in the 1870s when the Victorians finally buried her for, presumably, the last time. I'll also tell you why her own grandson, Henry VII, is largely to blame for this whole fiasco, and reveal the disgusting fetish this famous historical figure indulged in with the defenceless corpse. Katherine of Valois was born in Paris in either 1400 or 1401, I've seen different dates in different sources, and was the daughter of Charles VI of France and Isabeau of Bavaria. This isn't a biography of her, so I'm only going to summarise her life very briefly today, but if this video does well, I will do one as I get a lot of requests for episodes on her. She was a famous beauty, but unfortunately we have no contemporary portraits of her. This funeral effigy still exists though and is kept in Westminster Abbey, and it now provides the best idea we're ever likely to have of what she looked like, though she'll have had hair in real life, of course. In 1420, she married Henry V of England, to whom she bore one child, the future Henry VI, in 1421, before her husband's death in August 1422. He was buried in the Chantry Chapel, which bears his name, in Westminster Abbey. Today, visitors cannot get right up to the chantry or the tomb, but you can see the bottom end of it in this photograph. Unbeknownst to her young son, Kathryn later made a scandalous second marriage at some point between 1428 and 1432 to a Welsh squire named Owen Tudor, by whom she had 2 surviving boys well known to history, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. Edmund would marry Lady Margaret Beaufort and Father Henry VII, making Kathryn the grandmother of the first Tudor king. The Dowager Queen died on the 3rd of January 1437 at Bermondsey Abbey, aged around 35, maybe 36 if she was born in 1400. Her exact cause of death is unknown, but she recorded in her will that she had been suffering under a grievous malady in the which I have been long and yet am troubled and vexed. Her body was wrapped in cerecloth and sheet lead, placed in a lead coffin and taken to the Collegiate Church of St. Katherine near the Tower of London for a funeral service. Next it was transported to the old St. Paul's Cathedral for another service, then finally it was on to Westminster Abbey where the remaining obsequies were observed and where she was buried in the Chapel of Our Lady in the east end of the church. We do have a primary source which suggests what Kathryn's original tomb was like and where exactly it was located. After the death of her son, Henry VI, in 1471, which was almost certainly murder, see my video on that topic for more details, depositions were taken from those who had known him regarding where he wished to be buried, and one came from a man called John Ashby, who had been the king's clerk of the signet. He stated that one night, about 12 years before the king's death, so around 1459 or 1460, Henry came to Westminster Abbey to decide where his sepulchre would be placed. Whilst there, he visited the tomb of his mother to see if he could be buried near her. Ashby recalled that the king and his attendants, quote, went into Our Lady Chapel of the same church, and there beheld the tomb of Queen Katherine, mother to the said King Henry VI. And there it was spoken and devised by the said persons that the said tomb of Queen Katherine might be removed some deal lower and be more honourably apparelled than it was. And after that done a tomb for the said King Henry VI to be set betwixt his said mother's tomb and the altar of the same Our Lady Chapel. To which device the said King Henry VI at that time gave no answer. What this tells us about Kathryn's tomb is, first, that it was indeed in the Lady Chapel; second, that it must have been very close to the altar if the idea was to move it slightly so that her son could be placed between her and that altar; and third, that it wasn't honourably apparelled. In other words, Kathryn hadn't been given a fancy tomb which reflected her position. It was rather basic, to the point that her son's advisors thought it might be a good idea to improve it. Henry didn't make any decision about what to do though, and when he ultimately died, he was buried at Bermondsey Abbey in Surrey, then later moved to St George's Chapel at Windsor. Kathryn stayed where she was, and under normal circumstances, that would have been that. But the afterlife of Katherine of Valois was going to be anything but normal. The Queen's remains lay on in peace for several more decades, as the Wars of the Roses reached their dramatic conclusion and her grandson Henry Tudor came to the throne in 1485. In 1503, he decided to build a chapel in which to house his own and his wife Elizabeth of York's remains. The only problem was that the chosen location for this new chapel was right where Kathryn was buried. No problem, he thought. We'll just dig Granny up and move her. And that's exactly what happened. Kathryn was disinterred, the chapel in which she had been buried was taken down, and the famous Henry VII chapel which we see today was constructed, though it wasn't completed until 1516. Henry even mentioned his grandmother in his will. This was dated 3 weeks before his death in 1509, but the National Archives of the United Kingdom believes that most of the text dates to 1507. With regards to his burial and Kathryn, it says, "In our monastery at Westminster resteth St Edward, etc., etc., and divers other of our noble progenitors and blood, and specially the body of our grand dame of right noble memory, Queen Kathryn, wife to King Henry V, and daughter to King Charles of France, etc., our body therefore to be buried within the same monastery, that is to say, in the chapel where our said grand dame lay buried, the which chapel we have begun to build of new in the honour of our blessed Lady," meaning the Virgin Mary. Henry refers to Kathryn having lain buried in the chapel in the past tense, so we can assume that she had already been moved by the time this part of the will was written, and probably about 1503 when work on the new chapel got going. Whenever it happened, this was the point where the problems for her corpse really took off. It was insulting enough to have had only a poorly apparelled tomb, which had then been destroyed by her own grandson, but to add insult to injury, Henry, for all his precious words about his right noble memory of her, didn't even make sure she was properly reburied, or indeed reburied at all. Instead, she was placed in a fresh wooden coffin, the top of which was not secured, and placed next to the tomb of her first husband, Henry V, elsewhere in the abbey. There she would stay for nearly 300 years. In 1598, a German traveller called Paul Henzer was in England and visited the abbey. He said of Kathryn that she was unburied and that her coffin could, quote, "be opened by anyone that pleases." He added that on the outside of the casket was the inscription, "Fair Kathryn is at length united to her lord, AD 1437. Shun idleness." When this inscription was added, though, is unknown. It might have been on the wooden box provided for her in Henry VII's reign, rather than a remnant of her earlier coffin. We have a more detailed description of her situation and treatment published in 1631 and written by John Weaver in his book examining ancient funeral monuments in Great Britain and Ireland. He said, "Here lieth Kathryn, Queen of England, wife to the foresaid Henry V, in a chest or coffin with a loose cover, to be seen and handled of any who will much desire it." Staff members working at the Abbey took people on tours of its famous monuments, and Weaver tells us that, just like the modern-day beefeaters at the Tower of London, who invariably tell a good tale but often get some of the facts wrong, these Abbey tour guides embellished Kathryn's story for their customers, for they claimed that her shameful situation was her own fault, saying that it was, quote, "by her own appointment, as he who showeth the tombs will tell you by tradition, in regard of her disobedience to her husband for being delivered of her son Henry VI at Windsor, the place which he forbade. This was a reference to Henry V supposedly not wanting his son born at Windsor because of a prophecy that a king born there would lose his father's throne, which Henry VI did, by the way, twice being deposed by Edward IV during the Wars of the Roses. But the idea that Katherine was posthumously punished for this by not being allowed a proper burial was of course rubbish. Weaver knew this too, telling his readers that the truth is that she being first buried in Our Lady's Chapel, here in this church, her corpse was taken up, when as Henry VII laid the foundation of that admirable structure his Chapel Royal, which have ever since so remained, and never reburied. He was perfectly correct too that people were allowed to handle the corpse, for we have another account of the remains written in 1669 by the famed diarist Samuel Pepys, which shows just that, and also indicates what a perverse little creep he could be and what a lousy job those charged with protecting the abbey were doing of caring for Katherine's corpse. On the 23rd of February that year, Pepys took his wife and daughters to the building and, quote, "there did show them all the tombs very finely. And here we did see, by particular favour, the body of Queen Katherine of Valois. And I had the upper part of her body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon it that I did kiss a queen, and that this was my birthday, 36 years old, that I did first kiss a queen." He too was told the lie about her never being buried by the man guiding him round the abbey, but by now this guide, unlike the men in Weaver's time nearly 40 years earlier, knew the truth, for Pepys said that "this man, who seems to understand well, tells me that the saying is not true that says she was never buried, for she was buried. Only when Henry VII built his chapel, it was taken up and laid in this wooden coffin. But I did there see that, in it, the body was buried in a leaden one, which remains under the body to this day." So part of Katherine's original lead coffin was still there in 1669, as was the wooden coffin she'd been transferred into in around 1503. Other information we can glean from Pepys's account is that, unlike back in 1598, when Henser said her coffin could be opened by anyone that pleases, the corpse was not actually on display for everyone to see at this point, for Pepys had only been able to access her by particular favour. If we look at this rare image of the coffin in situ next to Henry V's tomb, it's at the bottom right, we can see why. They were kept behind gates in an area of the abbey which was more easily sealed off from the rest of the church, and if we look at my modern photograph of Henry's tomb, you can see that this area is raised up and not readily accessible today either, which is why this is the best photo I could get of it. Pepys's disgusting little foray into necrophilia also tells us that as of 1669, Katherine's body was still in good enough condition for him to take her into his hands and kiss her. As we'll see later on, she didn't stay that way. What Pepys doesn't make explicitly clear, though his account infers it, is that only her upper body could be handled, and my best guess to explain why this was is that the wooden box she was in was sealed over the lower half of her body, with the removable lid only revealing the upper portion. Another account from 1682 makes the limits of what could be seen clear, and also provides further details as to what exactly was on show at that point. It comes from a man called Henry Keep, who wrote that on the south side of this tomb, that's Henry V's tomb, is a wooden chest or coffin, wherein part of the skeleton and parched body of Katherine Valois, his queen, from the waist upwards, is to be seen, and of whom many fabulous stories are reported for her lying here. But the truth is that when Henry VII caused the old chapel of Our Lady, at the entrance whereof this queen was interred, to be pulled down, the workmen, finding her coffin among others to be well nigh perished and decayed, what remained of her body was taken thence, and placed in this capsula nigh her husband, where it hath continued ever since. He continued by confirming what Pepys had said about gaining access to the remains, writing that the body was not frequently shown to any, but as an especial favour by some of the chief officers of the church. So Katheryn was a tourist attraction, but only for those deemed worthy of seeing her, so probably those willing and able to pay extra. The remains were, by this time, also in increasingly poor condition. She was now partially skeletonized, and what could be seen of her flesh and skin was parched. It was little wonder. By this stage, she'd been in the open air for around 180 years, and it's clear from how Pepys was able to treat the corpse that little or no care was taken to protect her from the ghouls who were allowed in to see her. Furthermore, as I'll demonstrate in a few minutes, others were doing as bad or worse to her. Pepys is just the one who left a detailed record of his activities behind. Before I get to the increasingly violent treatment her corpse endured though, if you're enjoying this video, please do give it a thumbs up, as this makes the algorithm happy and helps to get it in front of other people who might find it interesting. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel too, with the notification bell switched on so that you never miss one of my uploads. If you'd like more bonus material and perks from me, you can become a channel member here on YouTube by clicking the join button under videos or on my homepage, then following the on-screen instructions. You can also find me on Patreon, Instagram and my Amazon storefront, and you can sign up to my free mailing list on my website and get a complimentary download giving you 5 quick and easy tips for spotting good and bad history books before you buy them or start reading. All the links you'll need are below for you. In 1723, we get another, more detailed account of the remains situation, this time from writer John Dart in his History of the Abbey. He recorded that on the pavement, close to the side of the former tomb, lies an old wooden chest or coffin, in which is enclosed the body of Kathryn, queen to the aforesaid Henry V. He goes on to recount the story of her original burial and disinterment during the reign of Henry VII, saying that the body was taken up, and the coffin being decayed, it was put in a wooden chest and placed near her husband's tomb at the east end of the Friars, where it has ever since continued to be seen, the bones being firmly united and thinly clothed with flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather, a view fit to represent to us the end of beauty, greatness, and what else sublunary things we boast. Sublunary, by the way, means things belonging to this world. He adds another fascinating detail, which is that at that time there lay a tablet near the coffin which had both Latin and English verses on it, one being a rough translation of the other, which he assumed dated to the reign of Henry VIII. It certainly couldn't have predated the reign of Henry VII, as it mentioned him being king. It said, "Here lies Queen Katheryn closed in grave, the French king's daughter fair, and of thy kingdom the true undoubted heir. Twice joyful wife in marriage matched to Henry V by name, because through her he nobled was and shined in double fame. The King of England by descent and by Queen Katheryn's right, the realm of France he did enjoy, triumphant king of might. A happy queen to Englishmen, she came right grateful here, and 4 days' space they honoured God with mouth and reverend fear. Henry VI this queen brought forth in painful labour's plight, in whose empire a Frenchman was, and eke an English wight. Under no lucky planet born, unto himself nor throne, but equal with his parents both in pure religion. If Owen Tudor after this thy next son Edmund was, O Katheryn a renowned prince that did in glory pass. Henry VII a Briton pearl, a gem of England's joy. A peerless prince was Edmund's son, a good and gracious boy. Therefore a happy wife this was, a happy mother pure. Thrice happy child, but grandame she, more than thrice happy sure." As you may have twigged during my reading of that, thanks to changes in how English is pronounced, some of the rhymes in the poem, like throne and religion and was and pass, no longer work, but they would have done when it was written. It makes sense that Henry VII or Henry VIII would have had this tablet added. As a French princess and Queen of England, Katheryn gave Henry VII his strongest dose of royal blood, even if it didn't come from English stock. His English royal blood was a lot more remote and came from a line which had originally been declared illegitimate. It was therefore important to talk up their connection, though this only makes it all the more shocking that he didn't have her reinterred, and that none of his immediate descendants did either. So Dart establishes for us that Kathryn's remains in the reign of George I were in an advanced state of decay, accelerated by being in an unsealed wooden coffin and regularly handled and abused for centuries. As I mentioned earlier though, this abuse escalated the more time went on, to the point that the only English queen I'm aware of who was worse treated in death is Catherine Parr, and I'll leave my video all about her horrendous abuse linked on screen and below. Writing no later than 1796, because that's when the relevant book was published, but recalling a time at least several decades earlier, Richard Gough recorded of Catherine's body that, "Of late years the Westminster scholars amused themselves with tearing it to pieces, and one in particular, who bore a principal character in the police of India, lies under the imputation of having contributed in an especial manner to that havoc. I can just remember seeing some shapeless masses of the mummy of a whitish colour." So Katherine of Valois' remains were now in a very sorry state. What was left of her was a whitish, shapeless mummy to the best of Gough's recollections, and even that had been torn to pieces by a bunch of schoolboys. It is another truly damning indictment on those responsible for managing and caring for Westminster Abbey at the time, and is an excellent example of why I don't generally believe we should display dead people to the public, even in the way that we still do today, which is usually in glass cases. There are simply too many sick freaks out there who obsess over what corpses look like and want to interfere with them. Better to just bury or cremate the bodies and not give the weirdos any opportunities to get near them. And if you're famous, you definitely want to have an anonymous burial. Gough finished his account by saying that Katherine was by then under lock and key somewhere in the Abbey, waiting for the next time the royal vault would be opened so that she could be placed into it. But this wasn't quite correct. In fact, to learn what had actually happened to her in the interim between him seeing her mummy torn to pieces and the publication of his book, we need to backtrack a little to December 1776. At that time, the remains of the recently deceased Elizabeth Percy, Duchess of Northumberland, were being placed in a vault underneath the monument of Sir George Villiers in the St. Nicholas Chapel in the Abbey. Just to help you with the geography of the chapel, the big white tomb effigy in the foreground of this image is the Villiers monument to Sir George and his wife, who was the Countess of Buckingham in her own right. The black and white monument at the back left of the image is the Northumberland monument, which was put up in the late 1770s in memory of the Duchess by her husband, though the vault had been in use by the family since 1745. It would appear from the sources I've read that a separate Northumberland vault was actually under construction after the Duchess died, for there was and is a distinct Villiers vault under the same floor, and it was in that area that what was left of Katherine was deposited, directly under the white marble effigy of Lady Buckingham that you're looking at here. So possibly there was originally one large vault which was being split into two by the addition of a wall, but I'm just guessing here. Although the Duchess of Northumberland died in December 1776, Katherine was only relocated in 1778, which would make sense if construction work was underway to divide the space up into two separate areas. The Queen was placed in a roughly hewn rectangular elm box measuring only 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot 8 inches and a foot in depth, and which had hinges. Their presence and its small size suggests that it was originally constructed for some other purpose. In fact, the description I've read of it strongly reminds me of the arrow chest into which Anne Boleyn's remains were squashed after her execution in 1536. A lead plate was fixed to the top, which read, "Katherine of Valois, Queen to Henry V, 1437. Deposited in this chapel of St. Nicholas by Benjamin Fido, Clerk of Works of Westminster Abbey, 1778. So Katherine had now been buried, or interred if we're going to be technical, twice. Once again, that should have been that, for the deceased queen was now no longer accessible without having to go through the Northumberland vault. And yet, as happens so often to Katherine, her remains hadn't been seen for the last time yet. We now move forwards to December 1877 and the reign of Queen Victoria. Lord Henry Percy had just died and the Northumberland vault was being opened to receive his remains. This afforded an opportunity to see if Kathryn really was in the adjoining Villiers vault, for the certainty of that fact seems to have been forgotten in the intervening century. Now, as you can see from my photo of the Northumberland monument, 17 people had been placed in that vault since Elizabeth's burial back in 1776, the most recent of them in 1867. So why, you might wonder, was the decision taken to go hunting for Kathryn's remains now? Well, all I can surmise is that the idea of Kathryn being left in an unmarked tomb had become unpalatable to her descendant, Queen Victoria, and also that Victoria was on a bit of a roll at the time when it came to allowing dead queens to be dug up and reinterred. Anne Boleyn was removed from her burial place in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London at about the same time, and some of the same people were even present at both disinterments, specifically a man named Doyne Courtney Bell. I'll leave my video all about digging up Anne linked below for you, which I do recommend you check out if you haven't already, as it's my most popular video ever. We have a first-hand account of what happened next from Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, the Dean of the Abbey. The evening after Lord Henry was interred, the Northumberland vault was re-entered and a little hole was made in the wall between it and the Villiers vault. Peering through it, those assembled were able to see the box with Kathryn's remains in it resting on top of a pile of coffins. The lead plate on it was visible and part of her name could be read, thus confirming who it was. The next day, part of the separation wall was taken down so that the box could be lifted out. It was not without difficulty, though. Moisture had seeped into the vault and the wooden box was leaning up against a damp wall. As a result, part of it had been reduced to soft pulp that had broken up, though the rest of it was intact. After a tricky operation that involved sliding a new wooden panel beneath it and screwing another plank to the side to stabilise it, it was gently removed from the vault and taken up into the chapel. There the rotted wood was removed and Kathryn's remains were once again on display. The entire lead plate was still there and still legible. That's why I was able to quote it to you a minute ago. But Kathryn was in a terrible condition. In fact, a great deal of her wasn't even there anymore, and while natural decomposition would account for that in part, I strongly suspect that much of her body, or skeleton, had been stolen by souvenir hunters in the time that she had been left on the Abbey floor. So just how much of her was actually left? Stanley tells us that barely half her skull was present. Both jawbones and all her teeth were gone, and only one rib remained, while a number of vertebrae were missing too. For those of you interested in that sort of thing, I can therefore tell you that there would be zero chance of a facial reconstruction, even if she was disinterred again. To squish her into this makeshift coffin, the bits of her skull which remained had been placed on her pelvis. Part of her right arm was gone too, though the left arm and hand were present and in good condition. The lower half of the body was also present and correct, having been wrapped in many layers of cerecloth after Kathryn died, and, based on the accounts of those who saw her on the Abbey floor and talked about only viewing her from the waist up, not available for inspection and touching during those centuries. From measuring the leg bones, it was estimated that she had stood 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 inches in height, tall for the medieval period. She also had long arms and delicate feet and ankles. It was evident that lime had been thrown over the bones and remaining flesh, which it was believed would help to destroy bodies, but I have no idea why anyone would try to do that to Katherine of Valois. That said, if you've seen my video on the disappearance of Queen Catherine Howard's corpse, you'll know that the supposedly destructive properties which the Victorians attributed to lime aren't accurate, and the fact that Katherine of Valois' remains still existed at least 99 years after it had apparently been thrown on them further confirms that it doesn't dissolve human bodies. The flesh and bones still appeared corroded though, but that was perhaps due to their age, the rough handling they had endured, and the moisture they had been exposed to over the centuries. The skull also had some crush damage. I've just summarised the condition of what was left here, but my historical figure and time traveller patrons will be hearing a detailed description of her remains this week, written up by those who saw her in 1877 and 1878. So do make sure to join us over on Patreon if you'd like to hear that. It includes a list of exactly what bones were missing, the condition of the soft tissue, and how the bones reacted to being out in the open air. The bonus podcast will stay in my Patreon archive, so even if you join up at a later date, you should still be able to just look it up. The remains were placed into a newly strengthened box, sealed up, and taken to the chantry of Henry V that same afternoon, with Doincourtney Bell remarking as they walked Katherine to her new grave that they were now attending her third funeral. This time, though, she was not left on the floor next to the tomb. On the 18th of December, the box was placed in a new wooden coffin of English oak, and the lead plate from 1778 was fixed to the lid, as was a new plate which read, "The former chest, which for 99 years had decayed in the Villiers vault in the chapel of St. Nicholas, was removed thence, and this new chest, including the royal remains, was, with the sanction of Queen Victoria, placed here in this chantry of King Henry V, by Thomas Wright, Clerk of Works at Westminster Abbey, in the presence of Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, D.D., Dean of Westminster, A.D. 1878. An altar tomb was now constructed for Katherine out of 3 slabs of grey marble and the altar slab which had been in the floor of the chantry, and the coffin containing her remains was placed into it and sealed up on the 29th of January 1878. On the front of this tomb is a Latin inscription which translates as, "Below this table, once the altar of this chapel, for long cast down and broken up by fire," not sure what that's a reference to, "rest at last, after various vicissitudes, finally deposited here by command of Queen Victoria, the bones of Katherine de Valois, daughter of Charles VI, King of France, wife of Henry V, mother of Henry VI, grandmother of Henry VII, born 1400, crowned 1421, died 1438. It's typical of the crazy journey that Katherine's bones have been on that what is hopefully her final resting place and memorial doesn't even have the correct year of death on it. She died in 1437, you'll recall. That era aside, however, the tomb is beautiful, peaceful, and it means she is once again very close to the remains of Henry V. It also has the year 1878 engraved on it, and is decorated with Henry's coat of arms and 3 of his badges, showing a beacon, an antelope, and a swan. To see a photograph of it, check out the link I've left in the description box to Westminster Abbey's website. Whether you like its design or not, it's certainly a big step up for this queen, from being left on the floor like a pile of rubbish and gawked at and abused by countless, mostly nameless creeps for hundreds of years. That brings us to the end of the story of the strange afterlife of Katherine of Valois. I hope you find it interesting. Let me know below who you blame the most for her appalling treatment over the years, whether it's her grandson for disinterring her or any of her other descendants for not reinterring her for so long. For other tales of the scandalous treatment of dead royals, I recommend you try my Dead Bodies playlist, as I have too many of them to put on screen here. But if you're not sure where to begin, Catherine Parr's horrific treatment is a good starting place, and of course there's also the story of how Anne Boleyn was dug up by the Victorians. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.